This is basically the best place in the house. So she's kind of told me, elevate the laptop. So normally the laptop would be flat on the table. She was like, no, you need to put it on top of like a shoebox. Okay. Oh, looks like we're live. I'm so sorry. Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for this virtual Q&A built around the film Cane River. I am so happy to be presenting this today. Thank you for joining us. This is put together in conjunction with the Houston Cinema Arts Society, Houston Cinema Arts Society Festival, and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. I am your host for today, Bun B, recording artist, guest lecturer at Rice University, and also board member for the Houston Cinema Arts Society. If you are not familiar with the Houston Cinema Arts Society, you should be, and I hope after this you will be. We present films, media, performances, and more of that sort to audience of people here in Houston, but also to people outside of Houston, which is why I hope you are tuning in from somewhere, not only from Houston, but outside of Houston. I'd like to give a big thanks to the Museum of Fine Arts Houston for also hosting this. And so if you are in Houston or planning to visit Houston, do so safely. But if you do plan to visit Houston, please stop by and check out their current exhibition, Soul of a Nation, which is on display now at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston throughout August 30th. The Houston Cinema Arts Society will also be hosting a free upcoming advanced screening of the Sundance winning documentary Boy State for current members as well as 2019 festival pass holders. That will come with a special pre-recorded Q&A with the film's directors, Amanda McBain and Jesse Moss, and film subject Stephen Garza, which will be moderated by the Houston Cinema Arts Society's very own esteemed Michael Robinson. And that film, of course, is presented by Apple Originals and A24. Our yearly festival, the Houston Cinema Arts Festival, that will take place this year between the dates of November 12th through November 16th. So please be aware of that. We will have more information right here on this YouTube page. And for those of you that would like to send in questions for myself and our esteemed guests, feel free to do so in the chat box via this YouTube page. We'll be taking questions from the audience during the second half of this Q&A. So much for that. I would now like to introduce our very esteemed guest and a good friend of mine, Sasha Jenkins. Sasha, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Sasha is a New York-based Emmy Award-nominated filmmaker who apparently likes to take long barefoot walks on the beach. How often do you get to do that, Sasha?
Not as much as I should.
We're going to change that after today. I'm going to help you. I'm going to help you with that. He is, amongst other things, a television producer, filmmaker, writer, musician, artist, curator, and chronicler of hip hop, graffiti, punk, and also metal cultures. He has directed the critically acclaimed Wu-Tang Clan of Mice and Men, Word is Bond, Burn Motherfucker Burned, and my personal favorite, Fresh Dressed. But while he was in his teen years, which is just how amazing this guy is, he also published Graphic Scenes in Explicit Language, one of the earliest magazines that was solely dedicated to graffiti art. He is the son of Sacha Jenkins, who is the director of the film we're going to be discussing today, Cane River. We are so happy to have you, Sasha. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you once again for having me.
I would like to talk about my own viewing of the film. I'm sure if there are other people who are here and view the film, I'm sure they would like to ask questions themselves. My family is from Southwestern Louisiana. My mother's family is, we've never referred, it's funny because people always refer to Creoles as Creole. My family never really spoke of themselves as Creole. We were Frenchmen. So my mother's family spoke French. My father's family speaks French, but my father's family wouldn't be considered Frenchmen, right? The majority of the people on my father's side of the family are very much darker skinned people, whereas my mother's side of the family are more fair skinned. But this film felt very familiar to me in terms of the time period, the way people dressed, the way people interacted. The bar scene where brother is having drinks after work is a very familiar setting. My father, when I was very young, used to shoot a lot of pool. And I would be taken with my father to these joints, these juke joints, to watch my father shoot pool. Schlitz Malt Liquor Bull was obviously the beer of choice
Yes.
Black men back then. It was either that or Colt 45. But I don't remember black men drinking both. It was either one or the other,
Right.
right?
You had to,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean
you
to
had to
interrupt you.
choose.
Yeah, no, you definitely had to choose. And around these parts, I don't know about in New York around that time frame, but here in the South, that was the beer black men drank, was Schlitz Malt Liquor Bull. So the feeling of this movie felt very, very familiar to me in terms of Louisiana nights and Louisiana lifestyle. Um, I was very surprised that no one actually spoke French because people who identify as Creole and Frenchmen speak a lot of French. When I was growing up, and this is just my personal notes, my family would speak French extensively, but the majority of it would be so that the children could understand the grown-ups conversations.
Right.
But the strange thing about it is that it's not taught to the younger generations anymore. I've talked with a lot of different friends who grew up in that lifestyle. Excuse me. And we weren't taught French. Our parents didn't teach us French. And my cousin and I have become very concerned about that over the last few years, that may be a part of our ancestry that would die off with our parents.
Right.
But it was very refreshing to see a movie that centered around this. I brought it up to Jessica, our wonderful director at the Houston Cinema Arts Society. When I posted this on social media, my barber looked at the movie. Well, first off, he was taken aback by Cane River. He was like, "Yeah, that's where my family's from, Cane River." And it turns out that he is a descendant of the Matoyes, Madame Coin, or Quan, as I think they would say, right? Is his great, I want to make sure I get this right, great grandmother.
Wow.
So this movie had very, very deep resonance with him. There are two people involved with it. One of them is, I think, a production manager, and the other is a story consultant. They are Baltazars.
Right.
Baltazar is his maternal grandmother's family name. So he's like, he knows for sure one of them is his cousin. He wasn't sure about the other.
Well, it's
And
funny.
so,
It's not
and so
because
I was very no, I was
Go
just
ahead.
going to say, I had no idea that this was not a fictional tale per se, right?
Got it.
So how does your father kind of come into this story of the Matoyes?
Well, Balthazar. So my parents split up. My dad was from Philly and my mom was from Haiti, right? So
Okay.
my dad was fluent in French, and my parents split up, and his girlfriend was Carol Balthazar, who was from the area. And so she took him down there and he learned all about it. My dad essentially was a documentary filmmaker who was transitioning into narrative filmmaking. So as someone who was familiar with this sort of bouillabaisse, if you will, of African and Black culture mixed with French culture, which he was initiated in through his experiences in Haiti with my mom,
Right.
the Cane River opportunity spoke to all the things that he wanted to do because he had spent a lot of his career in Africa documenting, making films about Africa. He made a film about the pyramids of Sudan, which people don't know much about them, but there's a whole lot of pyramids in Sudan. And because the folks in Sudan are darker skinned, the history and the legacy and lineage doesn't really get discussed. And he knew that early on. And so he spent a good 10 years in Africa, and he decided that he wanted to come back to the States and start telling American stories from our perspective. And so the Balthazar, who's probably related to your barber, she put him down with what was going on. And he saw that there's a way to weave actual history in a contemporary way that spoke to a lot of things that African Americans are processing in terms of their own identity and in terms of how we communicate amongst ourselves, how we see colorism and class and all of these things that weren't really explored in Black film at the time. I mean, we're coming off of the Blaxploitation era.
Right.
I mean, my dad was a script consultant on Shaft in Africa, and he was in the mix of a lot of that stuff, but he wasn't really a fan of Blaxploitation, and he wanted to make films that represented a different side of who we are, a side that wasn't over amplified or didn't, live off of stereotypes. and showed us in our natural essence. And the reason why the film feels the way it does is because he was a documentary filmmaker. And so he was using documentary verite film techniques to make a narrative film. And that's why it kind of has his natural feel to it.
Yeah, because it doesn't feel like the average narrative-based film, right? It feels very personable. It just seems as if we're following Peter home for a family reunion, right? Like, this is just a crew is kind of following him as he goes back home, as he, kind of is finding his way through life, having decided not to play professional football, but instead, go back home, follow his true calling, which is about, being a writer, being an author, being a poet, so forth. And really just about staking his claim and building his legacy as it pertains to his family, right? The Matoye family, wanting to, fight for the land that he, the land that he grew up on, being very hurt by the fact that the house he grew up in wasn't there anymore, that kind of a thing. Is Peter an extension of your father in terms of being the poet, being a writer, or was that just, you think, just a character choice for that person?
I'm sure that there are some elements of who my father was in there. Our family owned about 150 acres of land in Virginia. And I remember going down there as a kid, and my father had a real appreciation for the land. And every couple of years, some acres had to be sold to pay taxes or whatever. Different family members who owned the land would die off, and so it would get split up and passed down. And so he felt that land ownership was super important. And in the film, there's a statistic that it's like every week, 1,000 acres, or is it 10,000 acres?
I think it was 1,000. I think they were saying like 1,000 acres.
Every week, 1,000 acres, and this is in 1982 or whatever, and that's an actual statistic. Every week, 1,000 acres of Black land is lost. So imagine how many acres have been lost between now and then.
Right.
So he knew that land ownership was important, and I think he believed it was intrinsic to our identity and our natural state, and that we deserve to be with the land and have access to it. And the way the rat race works here, it doesn't necessarily always work out that way for us. I mean, we never got 40 acres or a mule and all the things that we were supposed to get. And land ownership is just a basic right, a basic necessity.
Yeah, and it's a part of being, liberated as a Black man, right? Having your own land, being free to do what you want on your own property. It's also, ties into, ownership, identity, legacy, things that are, I think, very vital parts of, defining yourself as a Black man in America. When did you see this film?
I didn't see this film until about 3 years ago.
You were aware of the film, though, were you?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I spent a summer, it must have been 81, in New Orleans, in and out of Cane River. And I remember Rick James and Tina Marie owned the airwaves. It was Square Biz and all the other Rick James stuff. And I have very fond memories of that summer. The film was completed, and then my dad died soon after. So a family called the Rhodes family, who are a very prominent Black family in New Orleans, they've been in the funeral home business since right after slavery. They've been giving Black people dignified burials since then. They were the financiers, and Carol Balthazar was a friend of the family, and that's how it all came together. And that's an important part of the story too, that this film was financed by Black folks, which was also a big deal. But the Rhodes family were not in the film business. So, after my father died at the funeral, as I understand it, my mom and my uncle, my uncle was representing for my mom. It was just like, yeah, we're going to get the film out. Don't worry, all these things are going to happen. And it just never happened. And I grew up in Queens, going to public schools with people like Nas and Mobb Deep, and, being sort of surrounded by hip hop my entire life, growing up with my Haitian mom in the hood. But no one believed that my father was a filmmaker. He died when I was really young, and I'd be like, yeah, and he was one of the founding producers of Sesame Street, and he's won Emmy Awards and blah, blah, blah. No one really believed me. So years go by, and then about 5 years ago, I just Googled my dad, and I find an article in the New York Times that talks about an organization called Indie Collect that found the film in basically stacks and stacks and stacks of quote unquote orphaned films. Duart, which was a plant that processes film, had a backlog of like these films that were unclaimed. And so they had the negative of the film somehow. And I went there, it was literally like finding a needle in the haystack. How they chose Cane River, I don't know. But in the article, it mentions Cane River, it mentions Horace Jenkins, it mentions that he died tragically, and they don't know much more about the film. So I contacted them and said, that's my dad. I'm a filmmaker as well, let's talk. And that led to more conversations and Indie Collect doing a wonderful job and raising money for the restoration. And then I finally got to see the film as an adult man, you know, years and years, almost 40 years later. And the soundtrack I knew, because if you watch the film, music plays a prominent role in the film. It's almost like long form music video when you think about how sometimes how literal the music is in terms of how it moves with the film. But I knew the soundtrack because there's actual vinyl copies. Like he made vinyl copies of the album. It was going to be distributed in stores. And so I always knew the songs, right? The songs lived on in my mind, or I had the vinyl, I could play it, but I hadn't seen the film. So when I finally saw it, it was interesting because I'd been seeing the film in my mind based on the songs. And then finally getting to see the film married with the songs was a completely different, trippy experience. But, you know, when I finally got to see it, I realized, I was like, wow, this film is a real representation of who my father was and what he was about in terms of being a Black filmmaker who spoke for us and wanted to have a representation of us that was full and balanced and wasn't what you expected and wasn't what was presented. And he felt it was really important that if you had a platform to say something, you've got to say something. And, you know, that sort of spirit has sort of crossed over into the things I do. If I have the opportunity to make a film about the Wu-Tang Clan, it's not going to be just about the music. It's going to be about the climate and the environment from which they come and how their music is a reflection of the climate and environment from which they come. So for me, working on this film and helping it get distributed, ironically, by Oscilloscope, which was my dear friend Adam Yauch's distribution company. I had different offers, and when that was an actual opportunity, I said it's got to be my dad and Adam having a conversation about jazz or something else. And so I went with Oscilloscope, and you know, Indie Collect, you know, set it up and did a great job with the restoration and creating awareness. And then Oscilloscope took it to another level, and it's amazing to see so many people connecting with the film now. It's a very humble film. It's a very slow film in some regards, but it's a reflection of an independent Black film made 1981, you know, financed by rich Black folks, not in Hollywood, with all Black team. And I spoke to the sound man who was like my dad's, you know, sidekick and running buddy. They got into all kinds of trouble back in the days. And I said, hey, the film's coming out. He's like, man, it ain't happening. The film the sound quality is shit. It's not coming out. And I'm like, yo, man, you can hear everything. It's totally fine. So he hadn't seen it and didn't even had very little expectations for it. And I'm sure he's very surprised and elated by the success of the film now. And, you know, the Hollywood Reporter said it's one of the 20 best films of 2020 so far. I mean, the response has been phenomenal. It was in theaters just before COVID. And then in the middle of its run, COVID had hit. But I know my dad's dream was always to have it released theatrically. So I'm happy to say I was able to at least get that across the finish line for him. And now it's on Criterion Channel and Canopy, and people are really digging it.
Yeah, I mean, I found that, you know, a lot of times when you go back and watch, you know, films from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right, they don't necessarily hold up well in modern time. But I feel like the way this story was told, the way it was presented, particularly the way it was shot, right, kind of separates itself from a lot of other films in that era, specifically Blaxploitation, because a lot of that was very, you know, it was very rough, it was very dark, like the themes of it, right? It's a very unique story in itself, right? About this guy like not wanting to go and be exactly who everyone expected him to be, and kind of coming home and wanting to be a part of his family's lineage in a very direct way, but like a farmer slash poet. Like that's not a combination you see in traditional Black cinema.
Right.
But it ties into a lot of the subject matter that you deal with, right? Which is built around the poetic art form of hip hop
Right.
culturally. Do you see that as a kinship between yourself and your father in terms of film? Like, do you think that that's kind of like how do we get from Horace to you, without you not being, I guess, directly connected to his legacy in that age? Because you're very young when this film is made, right? And
Yeah.
you don't see the film until after you've already created your own films. Like, I thought that was extremely interesting that both of you found yourselves with poetry being a subject matter, right?
Yeah, I guess that's one way to look at it. It's interesting, like before he died, he was really interested in hip hop, and he was asking me all these questions, and he knew I was a graffiti writer, and he was asking me about where do you go to paint the trains and blah blah blah. He was completely fascinated by it. And he's like, I met this guy named Africa Bambaataa, and he was talking to me about hip hop and its origins, and he was like, I want to make a film called Zulu Funk. That was the two things he was working on his deathbed, was a treatment for Zulu funk, and he wanted to make a film about Black cowboys. Those were the two things he was working on. So for me to wind up doing what I do, it really wasn't because of any of his social capital or any of his friends. I don't know if you know who Stan Lathan is. He's Sanan Lathan's dad.
I'm very familiar.
Television producer. And he was a fan of the Ego Trip stuff. And so a meeting was set up and I met with him, and he's like, you look familiar. I said, yeah, did you know a guy named Horace Jenkins? He's like, yeah, I knew that N-word. I was like, well, that N-word was my father. And he's like, well, how did you get in TV and film? I said, it wasn't because of his N-words, right? No one really put me on. So I got on I started my little graffiti magazine. Then I started a hip hop newspaper called Beatdown. Then I did Ego Trip magazine. Then I did Mass Appeal magazine. Then I was an editor for Vibe magazine. Then I was writing for Source and Spin and Rolling Stone. And then Ego Trip started producing television. Then I did the White Rapper Show, and that did something. And then I became a partner at a production company. And then I was in a situation on a film about 50 Cent called The Origin of Me, where we went to South Carolina, and he met with his great aunt, who lived in this town called Edgefield, and he learned all about his ancestors who were slaves. And we went to a museum for an organization called the Red Shirts. Well, who are the Red Shirts? The Red Shirts are like proto-Klan. And we're in this meeting with the director of the museum, and she's giving him a straight-faced tour. And this guy who was like a mentor of mine was directing it, and the scene was going nowhere, and he felt flustered. And he said, go in there and do it. And I did it. And I was like, yo, I can do this. And so that experience led me to directing. And Fresh Dress was my directorial debut. And, coming up with hip hop, coming up inside the world of hip hop as a kid, just growing up in the streets, you understand fashion on a different level. And finally, how we see fashion is how mainstream fashion has no choice but to accept that we dictate how fashion moves. Hip hop is the new rock and roll. I mean, God bless Bon Jovi and Bruce Springsteen, but kids don't care about rock and roll in the way that they care about hip hop. And hip hop, as a cultural force, has way more influence. And our aesthetic eye, hip hop's aesthetic eye, is the reason for all of these, mainstream fashion things that are happening now. And I saw that, and Fresh Dress kind of told that story, and Fresh Dress just opened up all kinds of doors for me thereafter.
Yeah, and Fresh Dress, it's about, well, you think about, your father growing up during the Black Power era, and, creating a film that shows this guy empowering himself through ownership, right? Wanting his land back, right? That being a part of his identity. Whereas, you get from there, you get to hip hop, and that's what Fresh Dress does, is really speaks to empowerment through identity, right? Through the way we identify ourselves through our clothing and so forth and so on. And I think I think that there's a kinship, right, between Cane River and the work that you do in terms of showing how the Black man in America empowers himself based on his life experience, his environment, and the way that he projects himself through that environment. I think it's amazing that you chose this path without that being something that's directly, I mean, had your father not been a filmmaker, do you see yourself still kind of going through this path? Do you see yourself like picking up the torch, so to speak? Or is this just where life kind of brought you to?
Yeah, that's an esoteric question and a good one. You know, my mom is a painter. You know, my mom is from Haiti, and there's a very specific Haitian style of painting. And because my parents lived in Lebanon and, you know, Ethiopia, they lived all over the world. My mom sort of applied her sort of Haitian painting technique to the aesthetics of her environment. Once again, what it was that she did in the way that hip hop processes the environment. She processed the environment through her sort of native Haitian way of expressing herself and brought something new to the table. So I was raised in an environment where culture and the arts were paramount. It was just very a natural thing. So, you know, my mom is very creative. My dad is creative. And in many ways, they're my greatest examples and my greatest inspirations. Because at an early age, I understood, you know, like my father would talk about Tarzan, right? Tarzan, OG Tarzan, black and white Tarzan, the show.
Right.
He would say to me as a young kid, listen, I would go to the theaters as a kid when you could stay in the movie theater all day, and he would watch Tarzan. And he loved Tarzan because Tarzan gave him a window into Africa, the motherland. But he wanted me to understand there's no way a white man in a thong is running the jungle. He's not running animals. It's just not real. So he said, divorce yourself from, you know, what's presented to you as the main dish and focus on the side dishes. And that was a very valuable sort of lesson because as a Black filmmaker, as a Black person, as a person of color in America, you're always faced with this face of something that is supposed to represent one thing. It's supposed to represent liberty and freedom, and you can buy into that. But there's something else happening over here. So in order to survive and thrive, you have to basically try to extract whatever good that you can get from a really tough situation and reprocess it into something that represents your own identity. And essentially, that's what hip hop is. Hip hop is, I don't see myself in these clothes. You're not making them for me, but check this out. I see myself in those clothes, and I'm going to show you how it's really supposed to be done. And so in that Tarzan example, I learned at a young age, like, yeah, Tarzan, he's, you know, that's never going to happen. But look at the people, look at the environment, look at the other things that are going on that are true to what the motherland is. Just don't worry about this white man running things in his thong. That's not real. And so I've been able to sort of process and distill things with that ethos. And I think I've benefited from it.
Well, you know, hip hop also does that from a musical aspect as well, right? In terms of taking the music that we grew up with or music that we like to listen to, and then we reappropriate that music in our own way, right? Through sampling, through interpolation, right? So we'll take a James Brown record and, you know, take bits and pieces of it, take the breaks, as we would say in hip hop, and turn it into a totally brand new song, right?
Right.
The way that we interpret it. So I think that's amazing. We have a couple of questions here from some of the people that are tuned in right now.
Sure.
One question, they asked, could you talk a little bit more about your dad's previous documentaries? And if you have a favorite that you think probably represents him in the way that you knew him.
Well, he was the producer on a show called Black Journal, which was considered one of the first magazine formatted television shows in the history of television. And so it was a public television show that basically gave Black people free reign to talk about Black stuff. And so inside of that program, he wound up becoming the Africa correspondent. So there are all of these sort of mini docs that he produced on behalf of the show that represent his work. He did a doc about the first Pan-African conference in Algeria. There's a film about that. His film about the pyramids has the pyramids in Sudan has won all these awards. He also, as a television producer, he's won Emmys. There was a children's version of 60 Minutes back in the days called 30 Minutes.
Really?
Yeah, it was on CBS. And so he won an Emmy for an episode that he produced about fast food and how fast food exploits, young folks, particularly people of color. So
wow.
He had a really interesting, broad-ranging career. I mean, he was in Saudi Arabia working with NBC to help set up television stations. I mean, he had a very diverse portfolio of work based on being a kid from Philly who went to France and met all these expats and made his way back to the States. And my mom was on a subway in Philadelphia, and this woman just came up to her and said, "You're beautiful, do you speak French?" Mind you, my mother barely spoke English, and she was able to muster up, "Yes, I speak French." And then she said, "You got to meet my nephew." And next thing you know, they got married. So
wow.
the guy was there weren't a lot of Black men traveling where he was traveling when he was traveling and doing the things that he did. And it's pretty spectacular.
And so does this start in public access television? Is that how your dad becomes involved with the founding of Sesame Street?
Totally. I mean, my sister was on a few episodes. We found recently one of the episodes that she was on, and my mom used to say that I think child labor laws were like nebulous back then, and so my sister would have to be up late memorizing stuff, and she's like, "Nah, I don't want you to do this anymore." So my sister's fledgling acting career wasn't able to fledge because my mom shut that down. But yeah, it was through public television that he wound up connecting with Sesame Street.
And are these things available now, Sasha? Like, is any of this stuff available for people to watch?
I mean, I've started the Horace Jenkins Legacy Foundation, and we're gonna work to restore his films. So I'm in the process of trying to get that together. The Pyramids film, I have a print. I've got to see in what shape it's in, and I believe maybe the University of Indiana has a Black film archive that might have some of his films. So I'm in the process of trying to dig that all up, but Cane River definitely has been able to help make that a little bit easier, I think.
We have another question. This one is from Lawrence, who asked the previous question. Now that the film has been redistributed, that actually it was, had a theatrical release, have any of the actors, any of the leads come back out? Like Richard Romaine, Tommy Myrick, have any of those people has anyone talked to them? Are they still around?
Yeah,
right.
They came to the premieres in New York, and people loved it. People tripped out because they look great, and they're looking good. They're still here, and very excited. It's a bittersweet moment because, Tommy was she was she's a director. She's directed lots of plays and stuff, but she was an actor, and Richard wasn't an actor at all. He was just an ex-football player, and
just kind of looked the part, right?
So he did Cane River, and that was it. He
wow.
So to have almost 40 years later to have all these accolades and people loving the film, it's bittersweet because on one hand it's like, wow, it's so great that it finally came out. On the other hand, it's kind of like, well, what might have been if this film that's so progressive, that's still contemporary in 2020, what would have happened if it came out when it was supposed to come out?
What kind of impact, right? Would these guys, would Richard have considered an acting career, right? I could have totally seen him being in, some of those blaxploitation films. Like I could have seen him being like a Shaft-like figure, right? He's very
Right.
imposing, a very imposing character, right? I thought he did a great job.
Yeah.
You obviously you could tell he's not a seasoned actor, right? But I thought he did a great job of carrying a feature film. I bought into his character completely. He looked like he was a former football player. He had this very gentleness about him, right? Like a gentle giant kind of a thing. Especially the scenes with him and Tommy, the way he would like touch her and hold her, right? He was very gentle. It wasn't that whole like blaxploitation image where the guy would grab the woman, right, and force her down and make, very strong, aggressive, masculine love or anything like that. He was a very, very tender kind of guy. I really, really enjoyed this film. I was very taken aback at the fact that, that this film was lost in the way that it was and then found, and still, I think it still means what it was meant to represent. I think for me, obviously, I find a connection to it based off of being a Frenchman from Louisiana. It hit all the right notes. And I do understand the dynamic of Black people from Louisiana who are not a Frenchman, thinking that Frenchmen think they're better than other people, right? That's
Right.
that kind of light-skinned Black, dark-skinned Black dynamic that exists within the culture, So I think there's a lot of truth to the story that your dad told.
Well, and that's the thing. These are conversations that we have amongst ourselves. And
Right. It's a very Black film, right?
It's never processed. And even the church scenes, you go to the Catholic church versus the Episcopal, the other church, it's two different things.
Baptist.
Yeah.
Because I grew up as a Black Baptist, right? And I didn't know anything about the Catholic Church until my mother and father divorced and my mother remarried, and she remarried a Catholic, right? So I didn't know anything about catechism and Hail Marys and all of that stuff, and people not like singing and dancing in church. It seemed very, very off-putting to me. Like, where's the praise? Where's the worship, so to speak? It didn't feel Black. It felt like Black people at a white church.
Right. Yeah.
Kind of conforming to a white church, right?
But Catholicism, even in Haiti, there's voodoo and there's Catholicism. It's pretty strong.
That's crazy.
Catholics did their thing.
Michael Robinson, of course, a member of the Cinema Arts Society, asked if you could talk about your father's relationship with William Greaves.
I know that William Greaves also worked on Black Journal. So I'm assuming that's where they met. And, Greaves, I believe, had him by some years, not many. But I know they knew each other. I can't speak more. I don't really know beyond that. Beyond them being contemporaries and Black filmmakers, and obviously I can imagine they must have been friends and they knew each other. I don't know much more about the relationship.
My barber was very excited about the movie, obviously because of his personal connection to the Montoya family. And I think because of that, I think he got very personally attached to the film after seeing it. And he feels as if the film kind of ended, in the perfect way to justify a sequel. Could you see like a modern day sequel or extension to this story? I think, people would be interested in that. I'd be curious.
Well, that show Queen Sugar, to me, kind of feels like there's a kinship.
It's a great point. That's a great point.
Obviously Queen Sugar technically came first because people know that, but obviously came
right.
Whatever. But to me, Queen Sugar kind of speaks to what might be possible with a Cane River revival or a modern version of the script or a modern take on it. And so, I would love to work on that. I mean, I'm transitioning into narrative film myself, so it would be incredible to, direct the modern day Cane River. But there was a script that was recently discovered that my father wrote that I'm interested in bringing to life. It's sort of about a Black spy, sort of moving in the places that my father moved at the time. So I remember him being a big fan of James Bond, and I remember seeing Bond films with him. So, that's another one I'd love to see come to life. So we'll see what happens in the near future.
I guess that makes sense with your father traveling to Sudan and Lebanon and Haiti and all of these different places around the world, right? I could see that, a level of observation, like, what would it be like for a Black man to move through these spaces, like, but really actually engaging in those
Right.
spaces, right? I could totally see that. If you did think of doing a Cane River, I don't know if it would be a sequel or a reimagination of it. Would you stick with the original formula that your dad did and have one person do the soundtrack, or which was par for the course at that time, right? Like the director and the writers would get with one artist who would kind of bring this musical version of the film to life, which I thought was amazing because the guy is actually in the film singing, right? So
Well, he didn't write. That guy is just he's the singer. He didn't. I don't think he wrote the music. He performed the music. But yeah, there's that scene where he's singing at the party, which is kind of hilarious. Again, I think that's one thing that's overlooked about the film. It's right when music videos are starting to happen. And so he's telling the story about feminism and Black land ownership and color and class and racism. And then he has like a music video kind of thing, kind of as a spine throughout. I don't know, it'd be great to pull a Nas Illmatic and have some of the best producers come together and make a great album. But I think the consistency of having, the Superfly soundtrack to me, Curtis Mayfield, if you had an artist on the level of Curtis Mayfield working on your music, why would you want anyone else? And I think that the team that made this film was the right team for the film at the time. And that's what gives it its charm. And I know my dad did a lot of hustling, was like, yo, do this for me, I'll look out for you, I'll hook you up. So, it was the hustle and the scramble to get this independent Black film done. And I think all the musicians took great pride in the work and were proud to be a part of this Black thing. And I think, unfortunately, some of those folks are up in age and have passed away, but I know the folks who are still around are really proud to see that it's finally getting its day in the sun.
Do you think this movie is, a fitting bookend to your father's career now that it's been released? Or do you think that one last screenplay is the way to close it out?
Well, hopefully we can get that one last screenplay, but I think in terms of all of the things that he stood for, I think this film definitely represents the man that I knew, or the man that I knew as a 10-year-old, and what he told me he was about, and what he told me what was important. And as an adult, being able to better understand who he was, because I'm older than he was when he passed away. Like, I was older than him when I made Fresh Dressed, so
right.
It's trippy to be in this position and say to myself, okay, I think I better understand him now because I'm a man of a certain age. And 41, 42, you don't know who you are fully, you know what I mean? Like, there's still lots of things to learn. So, but overall, I think it represents all the things that he felt were important and all the things that he felt Black people needed to see about themselves. And he wanted Black people to see themselves on the big screen. And so I think if this has to be his last film, it totally represents everything he was about and what he stood for. So I think it could be a fitting end, but not so fast. We'll see if we can get this other one.
I love it. And so obviously this film being the last thing that he worked on, is that script, is that the last work from him? There's nothing else that was
not that there could be some things. There's a film, Shaka Zulu, that was big in the 80s. I think it was made in the late 70s.
I remember.
My mom swears that he wrote that script and he got ripped off. I can't prove, I don't know. I can't prove that. She always said that it broke his heart because he worked really hard on that. And it's entirely possible because he was so well-versed in Africa. The dude was all over Africa. So I can see him writing the script, co-writing the script, whatever, but I don't know. I've gotten 2 phone calls from 2 people in 2 states who had storage, came up on storage units that had prints of Cane River, right? That they wanted to sell me. And I kept saying to them, listen, we already have a restored version of the film. So I don't really need this. I'm just doing this because it'd be beautiful to have a tin that says Cane River that has the actual film in it. But, it doesn't really do much for me. How much do you want? Well, how much are you willing to pay? I'm like, yo, my man, I'll give you $500. $500. That's what I paid for the storage unit. I know some film collectors that'll pay me like $6,000. I said, yo, you know what, my brother, good luck with that. I mean,
I was gonna say, knock yourself out, right?
The fact that I'm paying $500 for something that belongs to me is interesting. But if you can make more money, go for it. And of course, months go by and he hits me up, yo, I got this thing, like, I'm good. And then someone else just recently hit me up with the same offer. And I said, look, I got $500. And they're like, nope. And I'm like, all right, good luck, make your money. I'm good. The film is done, it's out. And mementos are cool, but you can't take mementos to the grave. And we have an actual film that people appreciate. And so I'm good.
Is there anything else you would want us to know about your dad?
That
this movie doesn't tell us?
Yeah, from what I remember, he was a cool guy. I didn't have the fortune of being with him a lot because my parents split up. We were living in DC and my dad was teaching in Howard, teaching film and television. And when they split up, he moved to Harlem and we moved to Queens. And I would see him on weekends. But, what I remember about the guy was he was a cool dude, a smart guy, a thoughtful guy, a creative guy. And I think Cane River is the personification of who he was. So for me, getting to work on this film and see it actually got me closer to my dad and gave me a better understanding of who he was when, he passed away. I was really young. There were so many things I couldn't process. And so it's been a gift that keeps giving, honestly. And I'm really thankful that I had the opportunity to speak with you, the mayor and governor and president of Houston. And I'm thankful that so many people appreciate the film. So
I really, really appreciated it. It was enlightening for me to see the people from those back roads of Louisiana having that story told, right, in a very honest way, a very gentle way, right? Not necessarily an exaggerated view, right? Because a lot of films from that time kind of offered this very exaggerated, hypersexualized version of Black people. This is, a very honest depiction of working class Black people in Louisiana. I thought it hit every note perfectly. You know what I'm saying? I always go back to that bar scene because I've been in that room. I know those men. I knew those collared shirts. There's a scene where in that room where a guy walks up and he's got that coat and he's got the hat on, right? And if that isn't my dad and his brothers back in those days of my childhood, I don't know what is. It's a very honest portrayal of people that live that life. And I really want to thank your father for that. He could have told any story, to be quite honest. He could have told any story. And I think it's a very unique story. I'm glad that it was told. I'm glad that I got to see it. I'm glad it gives us a deeper bond and connection now,
Agreed.
And I wish you all the best because I feel like you're Cane River, right? You're very honest depiction of life that you see is just waiting to be told. And just the whole idea that you're now moving into narrative film, coming from that same documentary base, I feel like when I do finally see your first narrative film, it's going to be very honest and very gentle and very pure. And I can't wait to see it, my friend. I have all the love and admiration and respect for you as an artist. You've done amazing work. I don't think culturally you get enough credit, from Ego Trip on up to everything that you're doing now. Your impact in this culture cannot be underestimated. And if for anyone watching that don't really know what I mean when I say that, just Google this brother, look at his work, not just his film work, but his work within the culture. He is a very deep thinker. He's a very honest man. You put yourself out there a lot. You know what I'm saying? You've made very strong decisions about what you felt was art, what you felt was culture, what you felt benefited us culturally to this thing called hip hop. And I am grateful, not just for your contributions, but for your friendship as well. And I thank you for your time today, brother.
Oh man, thank you. I mean, been a huge fan since day one. And if you would have told me in 1995 that I'd be having a conversation with you about my father's film that no one's ever seen, I wouldn't believe you. So
Likewise.
and all the stuff that you're doing, man, the activism and being on the front lines is I'm so happy that hip hop is at this place where we have a voice and people listen to us and they respect us and they know how intelligent we are. You know, that's always been my thing with hip hop. Like, these kids are the smartest kids in the room, and sometimes the industry doesn't really encourage people to be smart, and people get caught up in not being smart. But like, everyone in hip hop is you can't be a dummy to be successful. And I'm glad that being smart is something that everyone in hip hop really appreciates and is pushing for. So you being who you are is very important, and I think that a lot of people benefit from your insight and your drive and your point of view. So thank you for all that you do.
Likewise, my brother. Everyone, I guess respectively in your own space, please give a wonderful round of applause to our brother, Sasha Jenkins, for his time. Man, I'm so happy I got to see this film. I'm so happy that I got to talk to you about it. And I'm glad that hopefully everyone else that's watching got to see it too. I'm sure they walked away from it feeling the way I felt. Sasha, God bless you. Have a great night. Everyone, thank you all for tuning in. And please, if you get a chance, check us out at Houston Cinema Arts Society. We're doing great things. And I can't wait for us to have your first narrative film be a part of the festival. We'll have this conversation again.
I'm all about the Houston Oilers.
I love it. I love it. Sasha, man, have a great day. And thanks again.
All right.
Thank you all for joining us today, everyone. Have a great night.
Peace.